Those alive during 9/11, what was the worst moment on that day? All the footage of people jumping. When the second plane hit, and it became evident that this was not an accident. My dad was a bartender in Fairfield Co-CT, near a train station, and said the cars left there in the parking lot was sad. Then some of his regulars stopped showing up. Eventually, he found out they were gone. My high school was on the flight path for an Air Force base. Hearing the entire squadron of fighter jets take off in quick succession in a way that they had never done before and not knowing why was absolutely unnerving. The hours before I knew if my mom was dead or alive. They wouldn't let us leave the school, and I didn't have a phone. From our school, we could look out the window and see the smoke. Some people saw the second hit. Finally, they couldn't hold us any longer, and I ran home. Mom was asleep and didn't even know what had happened. She had taken me to school, then decided she was going to take the day off and went home to nap and just slept all day. When the first tower fell, the feeling of absolute dread and horror, knowing how many lives were ending at that moment. The second one falling just felt like the end of the world, and in many ways it was. The world we lived in changed dramatically and immediately. Watching on television as people in the towers looked at their options and chose to jump. Absolutely heartbreaking. When I found out that my roommate's dad died in the second tower. He had gone down to the sky deck after the first plane hit, but they gave the all clear. So he went back up to his office thinking he would be okay, because he was there in 1993 during the car bomb attack in the garage. Then the second plane hit, trapping him. I was a child, so the whole thing didn't really sink in until later. My dad was on a plane out of Jersey at that exact moment, so of course my mom was freaking out. We didn't own a TV, so we went to Circuit City to get one, so she could watch the news, find out if he was okay. It wasn't until I saw my mom absolutely lose her shit on an employee trying to upsell her a TV that it really clicked on me how serious everything was. I am Australian. When this happened, I was in my early 30s. It happened late at night our time, but we had actually gone to bed, so didn't know until alarm went off at 5 a.m. We were dumbfounded. It was just so incredibly awful that it was hard to comprehend. We went to work, but not a lot of work got done that day. Everyone was just crowded around a TV in shock. And I will never forget seeing all those people jumping/falling. Just made me feel so sick to the pit of my stomach. Having been up to the top in 1995 when I traveled in the USA, I can remember looking down and seeing the cars like specks. And people were falling from that height. Sickening. The world changed forever that day. Pre-9/January 1st vs post 9/11. Watching the people jumping. My grandmother dying. The night before 9/11, my grandmother passed away, and our family gathered at home the next morning. That afternoon around 2 p.m., I live in different time zone, we got the news about the Twin Towers, and it was such an awful combination of close personal grief and confusion about what was going on with the world. The worst moment for me was watching the second tower fall live on TV. It was such a shocking and terrifying sight, and it really hit home how catastrophic the day was. The sense of helplessness and fear was overwhelming. School didn't allow us to watch, and teachers were told to not tell us much. By noon, we thought every city had been attacked. Kids were being pulled every few minutes with a crying parent walking them out. I think we ended up leaving early, but I can't remember fully, but I do remember traffic being held up, so our town and the 3 nearby could convoy nearly all fire trucks to the city to go help. Going home, you could see everything burning on the skyline. It wasn't until I got home to my mom on the phone, crying, that I turned on the TV to see footage of the second plane hitting. Pick any one of those. It was a bad day. I was in 8th grade. We had no idea what was going on. The principal popped in all the classrooms and said a tragic accident has happened, to gather our stuff, and to get on your bus to go home. When I got home, I turned on the TV and watched, thinking about what retaliation would look like. Nuclear war? Wondering if we were all under attack. Not just New York. I live in Texas, and my job told us to go home for safety reasons. It was so frightening. Watching live as people trapped in the burning towers jumped out of windows due to fear/panic. The worst part is it just kept happening. We were glued to our TVs watching all this shit go down and trying not to get numb from it. Everything just kept piling on, one event after another, non-stop. Even the next day, there were fires, buildings collapsing, and the most eerie part, they didn't find bodies for days. The rubble had pounded them into nothing. In the years prior to 9/11, we felt mostly safe as Americans. Then, as the events of 9/11 were happening, it no longer felt safe, and it hasn't since. That feeling was the worst moment for many of us. It was surprising how long it took everyone to realize that the plane that hit the first tower was a jetliner and not a small private prop job. Seeing all of the people jump from the flaming towers. It was sanitized from most replays, but when the event was being shown live, you could see one person after another jump. Some would jump 5-6 people at a time. You could see holes in the roof of a pavilion where the bodies tore through. And you could see the results on the ground, although identifying them as human was impossible. The thought of what those people must have been facing inside the towers that made jumping to their deaths the better option was horrifying. When Flight 93 was flying toward Washington, and we were wondering who of our friends were already dead and who were about to die. I was living in Okinawa when it happened, and immediately the base shut down and sirens went crazy. They had to prepare as if the attack was from Korea and act accordingly. It was in the middle of night, and I was like 11, so it was super weird. Watching people jump to their deaths. I wasn't in New York, but watched it live on the news as it happened in school. The worst part one saw was people jumping willingly to their deaths because the fires were too intense. That was chilling to see. I was 9 years old, and the teachers were running into each other's classrooms in a panic, telling each other to turn on the news. I remember seeing the footage and wondering what the little falling dots were. And then we realized they were people, and it was like my brain broke. I didn't understand and kept asking why. I couldn't fathom making the choice to get crushed/burned to death or to fall to death. I think I was too young to feel intense feelings because I truly didn't understand. Now I have to fight tears every time I think about it. It's horrifying. When the news started learning of Flight 93, they were reporting they heard a plane had gone down in Pennsylvania, and they were not sure if it was involved in the attack. Then you find out it was the most overwhelming moment for me, because when is this going to end? And as someone living in the middle of the triangle between NYC, DC, and Shanksville, definitely felt surrounded. Being a few blocks away, seeing bodies fall, then being told to run north. I was in my 20s, and for me it was when the second plane hit. That's when I knew the first one was not an accident. And for the first time in my life, I was scared about war coming to my home soil. It had always seemed like war was far off, and most people I knew weren't alive during Pearl Harbor, so it was like that for many people around my area. I remember driving home from work that afternoon and seeing neither a plane in the sky nor a contrail, and that alone was eerie because the sky over my area is a busy flight corridor. I lost my sister-in-law in the North Tower, 96th floor, Susan Ruggiero. It was horrible. We never forgot that day. The loss of one life affects so many. Realizing that it wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. My father was an airline pilot for United Airlines, and he flew transcontinental from NYC/Boston on a regular basis. I was away at college and had no idea where he was until the afternoon. He ended up being in Denver for almost a week, but he knew quite a few of the crew members that died that day. He keeps a plaque with all of their names in his office. Secondly, the jumpers and people hanging out of the windows to breathe. I feel like they fundamentally changed me as a person. The thought of people just going to work and then having to decide to die is a mindfuck. I still get very anxious in tall buildings and confined spaces. For me, it was that I just got home from Army training late on September 9th and was really looking forward to relaxing with my girlfriend for the 2 days I had before classes started at university. I hadn't even unpacked my gear yet. I turned the TV on, watched the second plane hit, and my heart sank when my phone rang soon afterwards. By the end of the day, I was saying goodbye to my friends and family again. Finding out that 3,000 of your fellow Americans were just killed on American soil. I was in 8th grade and my mom picked me up from school early. One of our best close neighbors was a pilot, and one of the planes was literally his route, although his partner crew was working the route that day. It was early in the day, and when we went to check on him, he was in his underwear with an almost empty bottle of Jack Daniels in front of him. He was not a drinker, and he was crying. His wife and kids were in the other room, not knowing what to do or how to help him as he watched his colleagues and friends die. That is my clearest memory of that day. On the personal side, my boss telling me that we all needed to get back to the meeting we were in. Everyone was stunned, so heartless. I would say by maybe the 9th or 10th person who asked me if my Slovenian last name was Arabic, then didn't believe me when I said no. That moment I realized I was not mourning a horrible tragedy with my fellow countrymen. To many of them, I was the enemy. The next day, the Indian grocery store in my neighborhood was vandalized. I was randomly selected for special screenings at the airport 100% of the time until I got married and took my husband's British last name. Being on the receiving end of that outpouring of patriotic unity gives one a different perspective. For me, it was not knowing what was happening. The first plane seemed like an accident, the second was clearly terrorism. The third and fourth planes amplified things. The uncertainty of how many planes were hijacked and what the targets were was present most of that day. Then there were all the anxious people around me who had children and other relatives who worked in Manhattan and around the Pentagon who couldn't reach them because all the phone lines were jammed. At the end of the day, people running around Manhattan with photos of their family members, showing them or posting them on fences. Completely irrational when you think about it, but holy shit, the trauma and the desperation.